I'm Stephen Pfeiffer. I am a William Perry Research Fellow at the Center for International Security and Cooperation at Stanford. And I'll be introducing and moderating today's discussion that looks at Russia and the Russian challenge. Is it limited or resurrected? One of the things that the European Security Initiative has looked at is the kind of challenges, the issues that Russia poses for the United States and the West. And if you look at the early 2000s, the first years when Vladimir Putin was president, he seemed to want to have a good relationship with the West. But then something changed. And after about 2006, 2007, you begin to see the relationship become more difficult. And then the relationship between the West and Russia became increasingly adversarial. After 2014, when Russia used military force to seize Crimea and then instigated a conflict in Donbass in eastern Ukraine, you then saw a steady downward trend in West-Russia relations. Now, beyond Ukraine, Russia, the Kremlin seeks to challenge the post-Cold War order in Europe. I think there's a perception in the Kremlin that the developments since 1991, including enlargement of NATO and enlargement of the European Union, have been inimical to Russian interests. And you also see more broadly a Russian effort to undermine the US position around the world. So what I hope today's discussion is going to help us do is understand better two questions. One, can Putin's Russia sustain the kind of challenges that we've seen over the past 10 years? And then second, how big of a problem would this be for the West? And I'm delighted that we have Dr. Timothy Frye and Dr. Kathryn Stoner here with us today to talk about this. They have both published books this year looking at Russia. I would highly recommend both. Dr. Frye is the author of Weak Strongman, The Limits of Power in Putin's Russia. And Dr. Stoner is author of Russia Resurrected, Its Power and Purpose in a New Global Order. And while these books look at Russia, I think, through slightly different prisms, they may disagree on some areas, but I think there's also a lot of convergence in them. So let me briefly introduce our speakers. Dr. Frye is a Marshall D. Shulman Professor of Post-Soviet Foreign Policy at Columbia University. He also co-directs the International Center for the Study of Institutions and Development at the Higher Economics School in Moscow, and he holds a PhD in political science from Columbia. Dr. Stoner has just become the Mosbacher Director of the Center for Democracy, Development, and Rule of Law at Stanford, and she's also a professor of political science at Stanford. And Dr. Stoner holds her PhD in government from Harvard. So how we'll structure today's talks is I'll let Dr. Frye and Dr. Stoner each open with some comments about their observations regarding Russia, give them then a couple of minutes to respond to one another, and then we'll open this up to questions. And for questions, we'll ask you to use the Q&A function. So Dr. Frye, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity to discuss Kathryn's terrific book and to say a few words about my own. And my book is focused more on domestic politics than on foreign policy. And it tries to counter the view that although Putin is largely unchallenged in open political competition, he's far from omnipotent. And I try to document a host of difficult trade-offs that Putin faces, and these are trade-offs that all autocrats face. They face dual threats of elite coups and mass revolts, and what makes this an interesting problem is that it's hard to resolve both of those threats at the same time. Typically, exacerbating one of these trying to resolve one of these problems leads to exacerbating the others. So in the book, I go through a host of different areas where Putin faces difficult trade-offs. For example, there is a need to manipulate elections in order to win, but not to manipulate them so much that people view the results as illegitimate and take to the streets. There's a need to use corruption to reward the inner circle, but not so much that the economy collapses and people take to the street. There's a need to use anti-Westernism to rile the more conservative elements within society, but not so much that it provokes a conflict with the West. There's a need to strengthen the security services to put down any potential revolts, but also not to make the security services so strong that they could be a threat to Vladimir Putin. And moreover, I document how the tools that Putin has used to resolve these dilemmas have become much more blunt over time. If in the past, Putin could rely on personal popularity, strong economic performance, foreign policy successes, and propaganda, over time, and particularly in the last 3 years, he's had to rely much more on coercion and repression. And in this way, Putin's rule has become much more one-dimensional. So hence the notion that Putin is a weak strongman, and the turn to rely on increased repression and coercion is more an indication of weakness rather than strength. So the notion here is that Putin is much more constrained than he's commonly viewed in most treatments of Russia. Now, I do have a chapter on foreign policy in the book. And like Kathryn, I tried to slay this notion that Russia is a failing state or a declining power. I mean, simply by dint of its nuclear weapons, its geography, its well-educated populace, general level of wealth, its military might in the region, Russia is a great power, not a regional power. It's particularly robust in the military and cyber domains. And I think Kathryn does a really good job of depicting the growth of Russia's military and its expanded role from the 1990s, particularly in the last decade, where I think people have paid less attention to its increasing military power in the public debate. You know, there's a nice phrase from Andrea Kendall Taylor and Michael Kaufman's piece, which shares Kathryn's view that Russia is a persistent power. So Russia has been resurrected relative to the 1990s. Now, also, while Russia is a formidable rival and adversary, it's also a brittle and one-dimensional power, in large part because of its domestic political system and a lot of the difficult trade-offs that I identify in other chapters in the book. Its soft power capacity is rather limited. For all of Russia today's efforts, Putin is a highly mistrusted leader in most countries of the world. It's kind of ham-handed interventions like attempts to blow up the arms depot in the Czech Republic in 2014, the shoot down of MH17, and involvement in assassinations across the globe tend to do more harm than good. Russia doesn't have a very attractive model for governing. Russian language is retreating quickly in the post-Soviet region. Shifting away from soft power, looking at Russia's economy, it has very limited economic tools for influencing foreign outcomes. The economy's been stagnant for a decade. Living standards have fallen rather than risen in this time period. It has a carbon-dominated economy in an era where demand for carbon is expected to fall. And as Thane Gustafson points out in his really good new book, Climat, there's really little in the Russian economy that can offer to replace the revenue gained from the fossil fuel sector. So although this is a problem that won't hit immediately, going forward, it certainly will limit Russia's capacity. More generally, an argument I make in the book is that while many people argue that Putin is playing a weak hand well, I argue that Putin has dealt himself a weak hand because of these internal dilemmas that he's faced. He's been in power for 20 years, and one would think that he would have done more to build a stronger hand. Right? The population of Russia is actually smaller now than when Putin took office. Russia is experiencing a brain drain, and this is not so important for security purposes, but it's hardly a sign of a healthy and rising power. Domestic political support for an assertive foreign policy is strong among the security services, but much more mixed among the general public that hasn't shown much enthusiasm for Russia's intervention in Syria or for Russia to play a direct role in the conflict in eastern Ukraine. And there's a nice piece out today by Maxim Samarukov from the Moscow Carnegie Center on how Belarusian integration with Russia looks like it's going to be far more limited than most people realize. The title of his article is "Why Moscow Gained So Little." Russia is a great power, but it's also a diminished one. Yeltsin would look on it with envy, but Brezhnev would have a heart attack if he saw Russia's current position globally. Now, Kathryn's take is much more nuanced, but I think it's true that for every analyst who grossly understates Russia's global power, there are also those who grossly overstate it. And it's important to keep alarmism at bay. I mean, there's no shortage of scholars or Russia watchers translating every sighting of a Wagner operative in Africa, every meeting of a Rosneft official in Venezuela, every hostile tweet from the IRA in St. Petersburg as a sign that Moscow is on the march and Washington needs to do something about it. I mean, Russia is a global player, and it's important to separate where Russian actions do and do not threaten U.S. interests. We need to, this kind of, overstating Russia's view encourages a view that every Russian advance is a loss for the U.S. But that's an argument that needs to be demonstrated rather than asserted. So I agree with Kathryn in the main that, Russia has been resurrected militarily, but it's also important to recognize that, this is a brittle and one-dimensional power. One area where we may disagree somewhat is Kathryn traces Russia's assertive foreign policy to domestic politics and argues that Putin's main driver for the assertive foreign policy is the need to use great power status to shore up legitimacy with the populace and the big men with big guns. And I think it's certainly true that the Siliviki, the security forces, are the driving force for Russia's security policy. But I think there's much less support for an assertive foreign policy among the Russian populace. And there's not really, and I don't think that that's a main driver, although Putin certainly tries to exploit this as much as he can. I see Russian foreign policy driven at least as much by opportunities and events and the ability to exploit U.S. missteps and doubts about support for U.S. Cooperation with allies. And the Kremlin is constantly looking for low-cost opportunities to spread its influence, and that these are largely driven by strategic concerns, not to completely dismiss domestic politics, but that is one area where we might want to have a discussion. A good example is the Middle East, where the U.S. has kind of placed less emphasis on the Middle East in recent years, and we've seen Russia build a whole series of relationships with countries as diverse as Saudi Arabia and Iran, with Israel and the Palestinians, with Turkey. But even there, as Frederick Wary and Andrew Weiss point out in a nice piece, a lot of the Russia's gains in the Middle East are more superficial than people realize. So all power is relative. I worry about Russia's rise as a military rival, but I also worry more about the decline of the West and dysfunctionality among countries in Europe and particularly in the United States as kind of a greater threat to U.S. national security interests. So although people might have come here thinking that there's going to be big, blood in the water, given the kind of different titles in the book, I think that there's a lot of overlap, and I don't see a big contradiction in arguing that Putin is much more constrained than is commonly assumed and faces these really difficult trade-offs. But at the same time that Russia has resurrected itself since the mid-1990s. And those who fail to recognize this are wrong. And I worry that those in the Biden administration would like to see Russia just disappear. They would like to see this not be a problem that they don't want to deal with. They would like to turn attention to China and want to give as little attention to Russia as possible. But I worry that is a mistake and may even encourage a more assertive policy from Russia. So at the same time, we don't want to understate Russian foreign policy threat, but we also don't want to overstate it. And it's important to recognize the limits on Putin as a decision maker, both at home and abroad. So thank you very much. I look forward to hearing Kathryn's remark and to answering some questions.
Great. Thank you very much, Tim. Kathryn, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Tim. Yeah, so I don't think we're going to see blood in the water, but we all knew that ahead of time, probably, if you read the books. Before we came on, I was just saying to Tim, I I've just written about one review of his book, and I'm halfway through writing another one. So, and I know he wrote one of mine, so I know that there's not much vehement disagreement. There are a few points though that I think are important. And so, first thing to point out is, as Tim noted, is that my book is primarily about Russia's orientation to the world these days and perceptions of Russian power. So, on the one hand, you have Putin puffing up how strong Russia is, and saying that Russia is never so strong as it wants to be, but never so weak as it is thought to be. And that in another sort of great quote from him is in 2018, he makes this claim as he's come back into office as Russia's president, that in just 30 years, we have undergone changes that have taken centuries in other countries. So really making a big claim for how far Russia is resurrected. And I should mention that actually I first had called the book Russia Resurrected as a question mark. And my editor at Oxford said, no question, we don't do question marks, where it is resurrected. So I'm glad to hear Tim agrees with that, because I do think that that is actually the truth, but it depends on what your starting point is, right? So there has been a disagreement in the United States in the last 10 years or so about how strong Russia is, how much of a threat Russia is, captured by statements like John McCain's that Russia is a gas station masquerading as a country. He made that claim in 2014 as Russia seized Crimea. Mitt Romney, following in his footsteps, called it a gas station with nukes. And Barack Obama infamously said, as Tim mentioned, a regional power. And this was really hurtful, I think, to Putin, a regional power threatening its neighbors not out of strength, but out of weakness. On the other side of the ledger, at the same time, we have Philip Breedlove, who in 2015 came here to Stanford, to CSAC, in fact, where this talk is taking place virtually, saying Russia is rewriting the Cold War settlement using force. The Russians, he told me the Russians called him breed hate for saying things like that. We have Generals Dunford, Selvin, Odierno saying that Russia is an existential threat to the United States. That's in 2015. They all make that statement. And then President Biden just last year in October says that when he's debating Donald Trump, remember that debate? That was sort of fun. That I think the biggest threat to America right now in terms of breaking up our security and our alliances is Russia. And our biggest competitors, China. But Russia, in terms of security, is brought up in contrast to some of his political compatriots on both sides of the aisle there saying, don't worry about it. So, the way I started this book is really what's the truth here. I listened to General Michael Hayden come and speak at CSAC in 2012 or 2013, and he described Russia as being at, since it was near Thanksgiving, I think this is why the image came up, Russia being at the little table with the kids. And North Korea is also at the little table by his telling, and that they want to be at the big table with China and the United States, but really they're at the little table. And so they'll get up, they'll make a fuss, but then they go back to the little table. And so I thought, that seems like a gross misread. And if he's head of national intelligence, I'm a little worried. So we see when Putin, after Putin comes back into the presidency in 2012, as Steve mentioned in his opening remarks, we see Russia become a little more aggressive on the global stage, right? So by 2014, seizure of Crimea from Ukraine, remember those little green men who didn't have insignia on their uniforms? And it turned out, although they were silent at first, very polite, spoke perfect Russian. So they come out of their bases on the Black Sea there in Crimea, take control of the peninsula. Russia goes on to support a low boil and sometimes high boil, as Steve well knows, war within Ukraine, in eastern Ukraine. Then a quick and really effective mobilization into Syria in 2015, which has effectively changed the facts on the ground in the Middle East. So I suppose here's one point of disagreement, Tim Frye, and that is, I think you are grossly underestimating where Russia is in the Middle East in terms of calling it superficial gains. We will not be involved in any possible settlement if there is one in Syria, partly because we've withdrawn, but Russia has taken that opportunity and rushed in. And you had mentioned that my book does cover some of its military refurbishment, let's put it that way, since 2008. And so we've seen some of those weapons used in the Middle East, especially obviously in Syria. But we've also, Russia has used that as an opportunity to increase its weapons sales throughout the Middle East. And one of the things I think that's very problematic for global stability and Russia's role here is that they're arming opposite sides of decades-long conflicts, right? So what they've done is Syria has given them almost a jumping point into other parts of the Middle East, including Libya. It's also given them markets. So one of the things that I think when you made the point that I think you possibly, Tim, mischaracterized, pardon me, my argument a little bit by saying that the legitimacy of the system is the main driver of Russian foreign policy. That's not exactly what I'm saying, actually. I'm saying he has to maintain the system of patronalism. It's a patronalist autocracy. And so some of that means generating income, right, for elites, and not really just FSB elites. And the security services in Russia, I think, function quite differently than in another form of another autocracy. And I know in your book you talk a lot about how similar Russia is autocratically to other countries. It is in many ways, but in this way, I do think it's not just that the security service acts as the security service, it's that we also have former members of the security service with very powerful jobs, not in the security service, but in the economy, right, as well. So Igor Sechin, running Rosneft, for example. But we also have a coterie of elites that really see ownership of the state or control of the state as self-enrichment opportunities. And so that's what my point is, partly by looking at domestic politics and looking at that patronal system of autocracy where, and this, I guess, is where I begin to agree with you, where he is somewhat constrained by that, right? So in principal agent relationships like this, where you have a client, a patron and a client, you have to actually keep generating goods for the client or the agent. And so one of the things that under sanction Putin has had to do since 2014 is find new places for economic opportunities, not for Russian society per se. And I would agree with you there. They don't really care so much, just as Americans don't really care so much about foreign policy as much as they do what's on their table and what their own opportunities are. It's really to maintain elite stability. And I think one of the things that you mentioned in your book that's really interesting, and I would agree with, is that Putin has for now solved, in the short term, right? He solved this succession question. It was a bit of a puzzle why in 2020, the summer of 2020, there is this referendum held on changing the constitution, and it has, you have to, of course, as we all know, accept it as a package as a voter, or and in that package is giving President Putin the opportunity, if he wants to run again in 2024. So that would have solved the succession problem, right? And so why bother to do that in the summer of 2020 when your term is not up until 2024? So one answer is elite conflict, right? And you point out in your book, Tim, toward the end that, you know, there's some examples of this. So I do think that's partly why he did it. And so that's partly my argument as well. And so, you know, there is a fragility to this system. As much as Russia has resurrected its global influence, and I you know, can list off some things like Syria, election interference here in the United States, Brexit, financing Marine Le Pen, helping out Orban, promoting populism in various places, hacking the SolarWinds, Microsoft accounts most recently about a month ago. And then moving into, and my book goes through different parts of the world. So the Middle East, as I said, right, selling arms, but also SS4 systems, turning Turkey into a very suspect, or helping to turn Turkey into a very suspect member of NATO right now. OPEC +1, the +1 is now Russia. So we used to say, right, in the early 2000s when Russia's economy was really growing, Mr. Putin has nothing to do with this and his policies. He doesn't control oil prices. Right now, he's got some control over oil prices. And I think any German would tell you some natural gas control over natural gas prices too, which are way up. So while I would agree with you and Thane Gustafson, and of course, obviously, if we all start driving electric cars, that unless Russia diversifies its economy further, and there is some diversification, not enough yet. You can't go to Target and buy something that says made in Russia. But if you're in the market, as China is and as India is, for nuclear power plants, Russia sells that. It sells heavy industry through the Middle East. It is building infrastructure in the Middle East. And it now has control over a huge pipeline that goes across the Middle East to the port of Tartus, where they now have a permanent presence because of their Syrian involvement. So these are kinds of things that can't be quite captured in GDP when you look at influence. And that's another thing that I try to do in the book, which is Russia does a little bit more under Putin than playing a weak hand. Well, it has a few good cards to play. And it also, as you said, power is relative and contextual. So it really depends how strong your card is, depends on what game it is that you think you're playing. And so it has actually, I think, multidimensional levers that it can use. You cover cyber, I cover cyber too. One of the things you said that Putin is mistrusted in most of the world. I would say that's not actually true. Maybe among populations, but that's kind of irrelevant, to be honest, right? In most of the Middle East, he's pretty well trusted and pretty welcome, actually, across the Middle East. He's making deals for Russian companies in Iraq, a place that we shed blood and tears. Sub-Saharan Africa, he's a pretty popular guy because he's forgiving debt from the Soviet period and building roads and marketing diamonds, taking a cut, of course. Pretty popular guy in China and in India as well. So it's really with those leaders that matters. But if you see the number of times Mr. Modi, Mr. Xi go to Russia, I think it's hard to say that they don't like going there or they don't like Putin. In terms of having dealt himself a weak hand, I would in the end agree with Tim, of course, that the vulnerability here, that as much as Russia has resurrected some of its, some power from the Soviet Union in terms of its instruments of influence, and I look at how weighty an actor Russia is in policy areas. So as I said, until we start driving electric cars, I drive one. I gave a talk yesterday and said, how many people here drive electric cars? About 100, people or so in the room. 2 of us put up our hands. So that's America right now, right? And until that number goes up really quickly, Russia's still got some authority here or some influence, right? In terms of manipulation of oil supplies and therefore prices. But then look at natural gas. That has very little to do with oil, okay? It's a separate resource. And Nord Stream 2, Russia's a huge number 2 in the world natural gas exporter. So, I think we have a long way to go. And I think that Mr. Putin's time horizons are much, much shorter than ours, right? So look at COP26, we may go carbon neutral by 2050 or 2060. Well, he'll be dead. And he doesn't really care much beyond that, I would hazard to say. But there are areas of the economy that have recovered as well. I guess the last thing I should say is that, ask this question is, would a different regime under Russia behave the same way internationally? And I think the answer is no. Well, it depends, of course, on what it is. But if it was a more open regime, then Russia could be doing even better than it is. And I would agree that some of the foreign policy successes have not brought success to the Russian people. Mr. Putin got a relative long bump in terms of his own popularity approval ratings over Crimea. But, you know, if your living standards are stagnating, COVID's not been particularly well handled. And the economy is growing, but not by leaps and bounds. You know, one of the biggest problems that Putin has is young people wanting to leave country permanently, and the brain drain that Tim mentioned. And so, you know, we always say in the long run, this can't be sustained. But I don't think the time horizon in the current administration is that long, and it is really about self enrichment by controlling state assets. So for as long as they're able to do that, I think this is the kind of policy that we'll see. So I'll stop there and happy to answer more questions specifically about my book.
Great. Thank you, Kathryn. Tim, do you want to respond to any of the points that Kathryn made? Tim, you're still muted, I think.
Sorry about that. You know, thanks a lot for, you know, kind of clarifying some of the areas where there's agreement and some areas where there are differences. And I agree, you know, kind of in the Middle East, that's the area where I think Russia's has made the most progress. And a lot of that has to do with, I think, Putin's personal relations and his skill as a foreign policy maker, rather than any kind of deep drivers within Russia. So I think those relationships will depend a lot on, you know, on Putin. And there's not kind of a deep institutional framework for sustaining those kinds of relations. And relations with Turkey, yes, you know, they're better than they were before, but the, you know, reasons why Turkey is a problematic NATO member have more to do with internal Turkish politics than to do with, you know, Putin's ability to pry him away or Orban's away. And I think a lot of what we see Putin doing is piggybacking on events that are already likely to take place anyway. So, you know, Orban's takeover in Hungary is really driven by domestic factors rather than by Russia, but Putin can certainly claim that he played a role. I think a similar thing is with Brexit, and even to a large degree with election interference in the United States, where, you know, if we look closely, it's hard to make a case that, you know, the heavy hand of Moscow was really the deciding factor. Now, I'm not saying that these aren't important issues that we need to pay a lot of attention to and that these threats aren't real, but I think we also want to separate credit claiming that the Kremlin is very good at for events that otherwise were going to happen from actual demonstration that it was actually Russia that was really making the difference. I agree that, you know, in the short term, you know, Russia is likely to continue to you know, be at its kind of current level of influence in the world, given, you know, oil prices or energy prices are going back up. I don't see big changes in the short term, you know, but looking out over the longer period, I do think that the energy transition, which I think, you know, a decade from now, we could very easily be seeing the effects of this in a much bigger way, is really going to be unkind to Russia. And what is really problematic is that you know, Russia's political and economic institutions seem to be particularly ill-equipped for creating the kind of flexible, dynamic, modern economy that would be, you know, really useful for projecting, you know, Russian power abroad. So I do think the, you know, kind of domestic political conditions are likely to continue to prevail. And it's hard to see Russia really making a great leap forward in terms of, you know, its economic development, given the headwinds that face on the carbon front, and also the kind of domestic logic of its political economy, which tends to reward the better connected rather than the most efficient. And I do think that has impact. And I do think it's important that to be sure, Putin has good relations with many leaders, and that's important. I think it is also important that he is widely seen as distrusted, in part because in terms of domestic politics, it's much more difficult to pursue a pro-Russia or a policy that's more sympathetic to Russia when you have large sections of the population distrustful. I think this is what we see in much of Europe, where there are interest groups that would like to see relations with Russia improve, but are held back by political constraints, particularly around things like the shoot down of MH17, which, if in 2014 you had said the Europeans were still going to be on board with sanctions in 2021, I think you could have made a lot of money by taking that bet, because, the prevailing wisdom was that this was all going to, I give it a year, 18 months tops. So, I do think that, for all the talk of Russia's soft power, I think it's much less than is commonly advertised. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Kathryn, any last comment before I go to questions?
Oh yeah, I got some stuff to say to that.
All right, the gloves come off now.
Yeah, right. So obviously, Tim and I have probably known one another close to 30 years. I should say that. So this is not a very serious, attack on Tim. So I would say that, of course, Brexit and American presidential elections were not decided by Russia, and it will be almost impossible to demonstrate whether Russia was a decisive influence. But one really important thing was accomplished, right? Not necessarily the election of Donald Trump. I mean, we had our own polarization, and as did the UK, right? And so, just as the Soviets did, there was a Russian policy to try and exacerbate this polarization. I think the success in the American case is that we did elect someone who was Russia positive, whether or not, that didn't exactly play out well in terms of policy for Russia, but or for him. But what has happened is the legitimacy of our system, some of our institutions and how they function, right? Electoral institutions, where they assisted in undermining a process that was already ongoing. And so, luck is where is basically opportunity and knowledge, right? And so this is one of the reasons that I think Russia has been able to increase its influence, especially in the last 8 or so years, is of course partly because of the domestic situations in particular countries where they have used soft and a sharp power like cyber to intervene. Are they decisive? We can't know for sure. Were they helpful? No, in terms of US national interests or Brexit. I think we're talking past each other in terms of parts of the world where Russia is particularly influential. There are parts of Eastern Europe where it's extraordinarily influential, and I think giving money as well to populists in Western Europe has been useful, right? And so the attempt to try to break up or European Union, Russia didn't start that. The Europeans did that well themselves. But Russia's policies have not been helpful in terms of keeping Europe together. Although I agree, surprisingly, I think on sanctions. I agree that also, Tim, that and that my book makes this point, right? So society is it's a weak point for Russia in terms of continuing to project global power, right? So kids between 53% last year of kids between 18 and 24 years old wanted to leave the country permanently in a Levada survey. That's hugely problematic. The brain drain is probably underestimated. I comment on that as well. And of course, population decline had flattened. We don't really know yet the demographic effect of COVID, but it can't be good when we're getting an estimate of 660,000 excess deaths, right? No matter what the government is saying. So, and I also completely agree with you, right? So there is a weakness here in the system. as it is, because autocracies are, as you point out in your excellent book, often very fragile. When you have a process on paper for succession, but but that's not the real process, then, when or if, and Mr. Putin is going to die one day, right? He's already surpassed the average life expectancy of a Russian male at age 69. That is a point of tremendous potential instability. And so can this kind of level of projection of influence go on? Well, that's the bazillion-dollar question, because what comes after him is as yet unknown. There's no obvious successor. So I completely agree that the domestic logic is under it both drives some of the decisions, right? So if we had a different leader, I think in a different system, we would see a different foreign policy, and there's evidence of that. But also, as much as Russia has come back, Putin still holds it back, this system of patronal autocracy. So there we are again in vehement agreement.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I think two great presentations. Before I open up to questions in the Q&A, let me toss a question to you both. And that's the difference between short-term and long-term. I think, Tim, you said Russia should be able to maintain its position and influence in the short term.
Yeah.
Kathryn, you said that Putin has a short-term time horizon. So here's my question. I mean, I think you've both touched on an economy that has some significant vulnerabilities or fragilities. I mean, if in fact the West does move away from carbon, that is a real problem for Russia. You both mentioned the demographic situation, young leaving, young wanting to leave, and the brain drain. And I'm trying to figure out how Putin looks at this in the long term, because on the one hand, yes, he wants to protect and advance the interests of his inner circle. That's part of the paternal autocracy. But he's also someone who I think really he believes in Russia. He wants Russia to be something strong.
Yeah.
But it seems to me that he's making short-term policy decisions that 10, 15 years down the road are going to lead to a Russia that is less well prepared to pursue the kind of agenda he wants for it. Can you explain, what's going on there?
So let me take a first stab if Kathryn doesn't mind. So in Kathryn's book, there was a question of question mark after Russia Resurrected initially, but then the publisher wants the blunt force object in the title, right? So my book is the same way. Weak Strongman, it's a more provocative title, and I think the writing is more nuanced, but no one's going to buy a book called the Kind of Constrained Strongman, which is probably closer to the truth. But what I mean by a weak strongman is not that, and some people have asked about this, is not that Putin is necessarily going to fall from power because of these dilemmas, but that the tools that he uses to govern are many. And what we see over time is each of these tools becoming much more blunt, right? So the personal popularity, the economic performance, the use of propaganda, foreign policy successes. There's no easy Crimeas on the horizon for him to use to kind of increase his popularity. And what the crackdown that we're seeing now is precisely the result of short-term thinking driven by the shrinking of the tools that he is able to use. And I think I'm not in the conversations in the Kremlin, but one could imagine that given how late in the game that this shift in policy is coming, this is not Putin's preferred policy, right? This increasing use of repression is something that autocrats typically try to avoid. And, I'm sure he recognizes that the corruption is strangling the economy even more so than he would like. But in some ways, the system is such that it's difficult for him to strike better deals for Russia as a country when he has fewer tools, when he's debating amongst his inner circle who, obviously just want more. So I think the short-termism, is really a function of Putin's political position, which doesn't mean he's going to lose power, but it does mean that the tools that he's able to use to shape, Russian politics and society have narrowed greatly.
Okay. Kathryn, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, so I'd agree with that, and that's the final chapter of my book, and is that society is ultimately the biggest constraint, partly because of policies, paying attention to some things but not others, underinvesting, as we're seeing right now in healthcare. Russia has a ton of doctors, but worse health outcomes than countries that have fewer doctors. So not underinvesting in that. Some investment in education, but Russia has one university in the world's top 100. State-run venture capital firms. These are not the best way to create innovation. Skolkovo, for example, right, is state project, which has had very kind of mixed results, being kind about that. So this is highly problematic, right? And there's Putin's own approval ratings have declined, but people still prefer him to anyone else, partly because they don't know anyone else, right? He's ubiquitous in the media. Real opposition or that is anti-system opposition, is not even allowed to run in elections. So I agree with Tim. I mean, this is a fragile system, right? The question is, you asked us about short-term and time horizons, and they're not particularly well prepared, partly because, largely because of the domestic political system to deal with these challenges, Steve, that you ask about, right? So is there going to be a company like Google or Apple coming out of Russia? No, there isn't, I would say. A smart entrepreneur in Russia who starts to do really well may well choose to leave and take their assets with them, rather than risk having someone close to the presidential administration or a local Putin seize their assets effectively and use the law against them. So this is ultimately self-defeating, which is why I conclude by saying, as far as Russia has been resurrected, it could have been with a more open system of government, with checks and balances, lower levels of corruption. It could be much farther, and that is kind of the tragedy 30 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Not what we'd hoped for, of course.
Okay, thank you. Let me take the first question I have here, which is, how much do you each attribute to Putin and the Putin system, both the principal features of Russian power and also the limits on Russian power? And I guess another way to phrase the question would be, how different might the features of Russian power and the limits on that power be under a different leader and under a different system?
Kathryn, do you want to take this? Because you take this up directly in your book.
Sure. Is that Matt Rosansky who asked that question, by the way? Shout out to Matt. Yeah. Hey, Matt, how you doing? Okay, so yes, I say that actually there is something. So one of Tim's points is that in many ways, Putin acts like an autocrat, and it does things that are typical of an autocrat. And I think that is in many ways true. But there is something about this particular kind of autocracy, which is very, highly personalistic and focused on him. And as Tim points out, that provides constraints. It provides opportunities as well, right? And so we have to remember those and opportunities to repress, opportunities to self-enrich. I do think also another point Tim makes in the book is, look, we make a lot about Putin being a former KGB guy. Well, he wasn't a really very important KGB guy, except for 1 year, right? Was it 97 to 98 when he was head of the FSB? Other than that, I mean, I don't want to hurt his feelings, but he was just a lieutenant colonel in Dresden. And, not super spy, not exactly the Russian James Bond. That said, I totally agree with that. That said, and you know, and Tim's argument, and I also say this too, right, is like, don't make too much of this. The people he's brought into government with him from St. Petersburg and elsewhere often are KGB or former KGB folks. That's because that's who he knew, right? So if he was a veterinarian, the logic goes, he would bring in veterinarians and we wouldn't particularly care about it. But the thing is, they're not veterinarians, right? They do come from this security background. And so they have a way of seeing the importance of the state, you know, or the way the state should function relative to control over society. So I actually don't think it's completely insignificant that they're not veterinarians. I would prefer they were veterinarians. I think things might be going a bit better in Russia in terms of civil liberties, especially for animals, obviously. So I do think that does matter a little bit. And even if you, okay, so not to preview too much, Tim, about what's coming in some of the reviews, these are just questions. When you know, when a person with a military background comes in, they have a view of the world and of the way the state functions. And we can see this in other autocracies as well, who have leaders with this kind of background. Even Chavez comes in, you know, not with always with the support of the military, but he has that background too. We don't see this in Turkey, right? With Erdogan, he doesn't have a military background, and the military is, you know, in his particular regime, not and security services not as ubiquitous. So I do think that matters a little bit with Putin, but it's not the full explanation of the way the system has developed, because it's yes, they are there. Yes, they have a lot of faith in the state and emphasis on the state and emphasis on the state versus society, right? Society works in service of the state, not the other way around. And I do think the emphasis on statism has something, it's not the full explanation for that viewpoint. I do think we have seen, and in the book, I take this on directly, we have seen a different leader de-emphasize the security services. And one of those people was the very brief period that Medvedev was in power as president. But remember, his prime minister was Putin, right? And there was a bit of a de-emphasis, though, some moving of offices from former FSB officers moving out of the Kremlin. They did move back in 2018, but they moved out for a period. So I do think it makes a difference. And we didn't see this with Yeltsin after all, right? That was not his background. And so we don't see the FSB or in former KGB folks as involved in government. So it does, I do think that makes a difference. So I think if we have a leader without that background, we may well have a different view of the role of the security services in the system. And I think we have seen even a different view of the role of the state versus society in the 90s with Yeltsin. Not that that was a consolidated, liberalized, unproblematic democracy. It was not that, but it was certainly a more open system. And we did see that too under Medvedev. And in both cases, we saw shifts in their purpose or what they viewed as the purpose of Russian power. So there, I'll stop with that.
Yeah, let me just add, you know, I agree with all of that. And even, you know, Putin's background and worldview doesn't really help us explain change in policy over time, right? So, you know, he comes into power with a much more sympathetic view. He's trying to improve relations with the United States. This is the ex-KGB guy, right? You know, if that is really what's driving his behavior, we shouldn't see that. And even for the first decade with Ukraine, you know, the relation is very different than, you know, than after 2014. So, you know, I think, you know, it's a lot of what drives Russian foreign policy is events in the world, changes in Russian political power. And, you know, going back to the Middle East example, one of the reasons why Russia has been successful is precisely because the US has been paying much less attention to it. So in this way, you know, in the long run, I still think, you know, the US is probably better positioned than Russia in the Middle East for lots of reasons. But this is just another example of, you know, exploiting the opportunities that are available. And I think, you know, we don't give Putin enough credit by just saying, oh, look, He was in the KGB. He has this particular worldview. That's why he behaves the way he does. But his worldview is also shaped by, what events that are going on in the world. And in this way, I think events like the US intervention in Iraq and the overthrow of Gaddafi in Libya had great collateral damage on US-Russian relations. And in some ways, it was those moves by the US that were not directed against Russia, which really helped to poison the relationship.
Okay, great. Let me take a question from James Davis, which is, if Putin were to step off the wrong curb tomorrow and get run over by a bus, who does the system produce next? Is it sort of a Putin 2? Is it something worse, something totally different? How does the system cope with that?
Kathryn? No,
He doesn't
Unless
step off curbs, so that's absurd. He just goes straight into the car.
Right.
The hot potato that nobody wants to deal with. In the interim, Mishustin would, kind of
That's
fill
the
in
process,
the position.
right. The prime minister,
There would be a process. But one thing, we know from these kinds of personalist autocracies that transitions of power are often really difficult. One of the statistics I cite in the book is that 70% of the time between 1945 and 2008, when a personalist autocrat loses power, it happens through a coup, through a revolt, or other kind of irregular means. And 80% of the time when a personalist autocrat loses power, they end up in jail, in exile, or dead, right? And in military regimes, the leader can go back to the barracks. In a one-party regime, the leader can retire to the party. But there's no kind of building ground for a future successor to be groomed in a kind of personalist autocracy like Russia. And it would be difficult to see Mishustin, who technically would step in, to really be the kind of heavyweight needed to resolve these really important conflicts. And the other issue, one thing that makes Putin different from the other elites within Russia is his popularity ratings relative to others. Mishustin's popularity ratings has actually been quite high, but there's a big gap between those two and everybody else. And in some ways that's by design, because Putin would like, everything is done to give credit to Putin. But again, that makes it difficult to develop a bench from which one could choose. And also there's not really institutions like a party or a legislature that would, facilitate this kind of transition. So, it could be quite messy.
Kathryn, anything to add to that, or?
I would just say I agree with that. I think that there's some evidence that Mishustin, who's the prime minister, is kind of angling to perhaps act as successor. But this can all change rather rapidly. I don't know, Tim, have you seen him play hockey with the team? I have not, because
No.
the only other person who scores as many goals as Putin is the defense minister, Sergei Shoigu, of course. And so that's, where for years the smart money has been.
Right.
But what stock should we put in there, sort of approval rating? Remember that the only thing I would add to what Tim said, because I think he covered it all beautifully, is that there is an official process. None of us believe that's who will decide. That's how it will be decided, right? And just as Yeltsin said, my preferred successor is Putin, and what do you know? A guy who we all had to kind of look up and find out who he was, suddenly won and then became wildly popular. So it is possible, I suppose, to turn Mishustin into that, but it seems sort of unlikely, but it could happen, I guess. And so it's, as Tim said, this is part of the fragility of a system like this that has had its formal institutional processes so hollowed out.
Yeah, Andrew Cutchins makes this nice line where he says there was Peter the Great, there was Ivan the Terrible, and there's Vladimir the Lucky.
Vladimir the Lucky,
So
exactly, yeah.
he got chosen at a time when the hard work of building a market economy in the 1990s was already done. When there was a ruble devaluation that suddenly made Russian exports competitive and oil prices soar. Now, whoever replaces Putin, I doubt is going to have such a nice conjuncture of forces in order to boost his popularity up to the stratosphere. So it's a kind of a poison chalice to take over Russia in,
But 20 years ago, who among us would have guessed that this would have been the president in 2020?
And who also would have guessed that Zhirinovsky and Zyuganov would still be, and Yavlinsky would still be
hanging on.
Yeah. Anyway.
Okay. Next question from Claude Ezron. In all of his actions in the last several years, has Putin done anything that's really important to improve a lot of average Russians over the last several years?
Oh, yes. Can I start on this one, Tim?
Jump in, yeah.
Well, Putin, right? So let's first disabuse everyone of the idea that he has, as Tim's book points out, complete control over what goes on in Russia. And when he says something, it is done. Of course, that's not the case, right? Weak bureaucratic institutions, weak implementation of policy is one of the many challenges he faces. So as Tim points out in his book, one of the advantages, of course, for an autocrat with weak institutions is they can kind of run roughshod over any rules that exist and use the law in their favor. But one of the disadvantages is when you actually want to implement policy that matters to you, sometimes that can be difficult. So in many areas, and actually this is a quibble I have with you, Tim, with your book, in many areas, it's true, of course, that, some of the domestic policies that and some of the grander national projects that were introduced have not been implemented fully. I'm not sure they were ever meant to, frankly, but there have been some pretty concrete gains in people's living standards, right? And so this is one of the reasons why he is genuinely popular. Now, having control of the media and also who else can, kind of hold office makes a huge difference too. But people's lives are much better almost than they've ever been, except before COVID, right? And so that does make a difference. Now, is that because of Putin and his policies? No, not completely, right? And so for a long time, not a ton of input into global oil supplies and supply and demand and prices. But there has been, as much as we don't necessarily want to admit, there has been some good policy, and that has improved people's living standards. One area I've looked into, and Tim knows this a bit, and I think you've looked into this too, right, is for example, some aspects of public health. So smoking, right? So Russians, big smokers, big drinkers, the biggest smokers per capita in like 2012 in the world, right? Tied maybe with Greece, even higher smoking than China. The worrisome thing was that women were increasing their smoking, where in the rest of the world they're decreasing. And so the Russians leadership looked at this and said, you know what, this is bad for labor productivity. This is bad for investment. It's foreign tobacco companies that are coming in and marketing like crazy. So they had a anti-tobacco almost campaign, limiting point of sale, limiting advertisements, putting those horrible pictures of people with throat cancer and mouth cancer on packages. Tim's nodding, trying to dissuade kids. And so they've moved where people smoke, right? You can't smoke inside a building. And Tim, you probably remember, and Steve, you too, when you would go to a cafe and come out smelling like you'd been, inside a casino, if you'd only been there 30 minutes because the smoking was so heavy. So this is something I think you can see a pretty concrete change. Now you might say, oh, that's a little thing. No, it's not actually, because that has improved life expectancy. For example, it has decreased mortality rates. So, that's one thing. But if you compare Moscow now to what it was 20 or 30 years ago, it's a modern European city for the most part, right? But that's not just because of Putin and his policies. It's also another good policy. Frankly, Russia is not a traditionally resource cursed state, despite what Rachel Maddow may tell you. because they do have, a national wealth fund. And so they have been able to smooth out some of the bumps that traditionally, the volatility of oil prices and the revenue from that would create. So one thing I think we can say that he has done is tried to keep his hands off the central bank, and they've had a good central banker who has done that. So, yeah, people's lives have improved in many ways. Could they be better? Absolutely.
Yeah, I kind of make the point that Russia's economy neither as strong nor as weak as it looks, which is an old saying among Russia watchers. And the macroeconomic stability has been very good under Putin. In part because of the central bank, but also because of the refusal to, abuse the manna from heaven that came with the high oil prices. So on the kind of macro side, the Putin team has done a very good job. It's really on the micro side of property rights, competition, and those kinds of issues that are really important. And there have been Moscow is really a changed city. Of course, Moscow is not Russia, and the kind of investment into Moscow as a showcase city. I think I never heard many Russians make the case that did Moscow really need Zaryadye Park? This beautiful, expensive park in downtown Moscow, given the difficult state of many parks in infrastructure projects throughout Russia. So, there is a sense that, wealth could have been spread around much more. But, there are, positive changes in people's lives in a material sense, even if in the political sphere, things have gotten much more restricted.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. Let me ask this. Let's say that Putin does in fact decide to run for re-election in 2024. My own view is he may not yet have made that decision, but he's given himself the option. But let's say he does. How does that affect Russian action, Russian assertiveness on the global stage?
Do you want me to start with that one?
Mm.
Right, I agree with you that I think that decision has yet to be made. And there are rumors, I don't know if you have heard this too, Tim, that he may be ill,
Yeah.
possibly he has Parkinson's, who knows, right?
Mhm.
But my guess is that we will have a sense of that in 2 or so years, because, well, maybe less. It's not really going out on much of a limb to say that, but because it's not obvious who would run in his stead, assuming he has not been hit by that bus that was asked about earlier, and that he is capable. I actually think he's probably leaning toward running, and he will win. May I go on that limb?
Going out on a limb there, huh?
Yeah, I'm really at the end of the branch. So that would be what I anticipate. I don't think the decision's fully been made, but there's no one on the horizon who he's starting to sort of groom in the way that he did with Medvedev. And that's really kind of the only comparison point we have, unless he pulls a Yeltsin and just pulls somebody out and they turn him into, into the new Putin. Not impossible, but I would say that he will run again, and that he'll win, and that we will see very little change in how they conduct themselves in terms of foreign policy, unless, and as Tim pointed out, right, he's reactive to some things, unless the U.S. and under Biden, we're starting to see a little bit of this, begins to engage in some ways where there are areas of cooperation. We don't seem to be doing anything about Crimea, right? We're not going to mount a big war over that. But we have had conversations at military to military level, and Victoria Nuland's been over there. And so, I don't think we're going to see a big thaw, but we may see a little bit of defrosting. But I wouldn't expect there to be a huge change there. I'll say that. How about that?
Yeah, I agree with Steve that I think probably the decision hasn't been made, but I think for Putin to have to step down, I think the economy and the direction of the country would have to be seen as being positive and strong. I think there would have to be a successor that he's comfortable with, and there would have to be some institutional framework that would make him comfortable, giving up this, enormous resources that, whoever is the president of the Russian Federation would yield. So although he probably hasn't made up his mind yet, I see the conditions under which he's likely to yield power as being very difficult to achieve. But I don't think it'll make a big difference kind of internationally. I think, but domestically, I think that, there is a sense of Putin fatigue, and it's hard to see ginning up a lot of enthusiasm for, another 6-year term of Putin in 2024. And, we should give Yeltsin some credit for stepping down when he's facing his second term limit. He could have, done otherwise and tested the water. We've seen one example Putin might look to is Nazarbayev, which seems to be one case where, for a variety of reasons, he's been able to step down with a lot of the usual turbulence associated with transfers of power in these kinds of issues.
Okay, great. Well, I would love to pose a bunch more questions. There are unfortunately 7 or 8 questions still in the queue that we can't get to, but I know that we have to wrap up. I know, Kathryn, you have a class to teach. So let me just close by saying thank you to you both for a really interesting conversation. At this point in time, if we were meeting in person around the conference room table in Perry Conference Room, I would invite and expect a huge round of applause. We sometimes can't replicate that on Zoom. So let me, on behalf of listeners, thank you all for joining us. And thank you for the great presentation.
Oh, thank you very much. This was really great.
Yeah, thanks. It was fun.
Thank
We
you.
get to do it again.
All right.
Yeah, that's right. We'll see you next
We'll
week.
have questions if you want to do
The
that
Tim and
again.
Kathryn show, or Kathryn and Tim show. I should say.
Yeah, we're doing it next week in Washington.
Okay, very good. All right. Well, those who didn't get to ask questions can tune in to
There
Tim
you
and
go.
Kathryn in Washington next week.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye now.